Rascal Chapter 5, September. When we curved up our drive, Edgar Allan Poe came swooping down from the Methodist belfry, shouting, "What fun! What fun!" Wowzer, who had thought he was totally deserted, came bouncing from the barn, leapt to put his paws on my shoulders, and knocked me flat on my back in the grass, where he lovingly washed my face with his big tongue. Rascal and the Crow were soon fighting over something, and Wowzer stopped licking me long enough to put an end to the squabble. It was a wonderful homecoming. Sweet corn was no longer an issue, being dry in the husk, but I had made a promise and was honor bound to keep it. I couldn't postpone indefinitely the collar and leash, nor the building of the cage. We had been granted our reprieve and now must face our problems. One of those problems was money. I had earned and saved enough to buy one Liberty bond, but my available supply of ready cash was running low. I counted the quarters, dimes, nickels, and pennies in my earthenware crock and decided that if I bought the leash and collar and the lumber and chicken wire for the cage, it would set me back about 6 months in purchasing canvas to cover my canoe, and that meant the canoe would have to stay in the living room another winter. Not one of the boys I knew was granted an allowance or would even think of asking his father for a loan. I felt fortunate to be permitted to keep the money I earned from mowing lawns and selling my garden produce. I took 4 precious quarters from the crock, put Rascal in the basket of my bicycle, and pedaled slowly and sadly downtown. Buying a collar and leash for my pet raccoon was like buying a ball and chain for a dear friend, but I thought it would be wise to have Rascal's approval and assistance. It might lessen his terror when he found that his freedom had vanished. We stopped at Shadwick's Harness and Leather Emporium, which smelled delightfully of tanned leather, saddle soap, and harness oil. It was a perfect place for Rascal to browse, examining the stirrups of both Western and English saddles, the brass buckles on the work harnesses, and the exquisite silver mountings on a set of driving harnesses being made for the local banker's high-stepping team. Garth Shadwick, like his father before him, was a craftsman in leather whose skill was known as far away as the county seat and the state capitol. He made handsome leather luggage, custom-fitted riding boots, and engraved book bindings. But most of his trade was in harnesses, and harness making was a profession threatened by the automobile. At this moment, Mr. Shadwick had a jeweler's glass in his right eye, and was engraving scrolled initials on a silver nameplate. I would not interrupt him at such a moment, and waited patiently until he took the glass from his eye and looked up from his work. "Well, Sterling?" "We don't want to bother you, Mr. Shadwick." "Boys and coons don't bother me," the harness maker said. He returned to his engraving for several minutes, then tossed it aside and exploded. "It's these gold-danged automobiles, smelly, noisy, dirty things, scaring horses right off the road, ruin a man's business. Well, son, speak up. What is it that you want?" "I want a collar for Rascal," I said, fighting the stinging moisture in my eyes, "and a braided leash to match. And they're making me build a cage to lock him up." "Gold-dangered buzzards," the harness maker said. "Cage for a little coon like that? Going after boys and coons now, are they? You want his name engraved on a silver plate on the collar?" "I haven't got much money," I said hesitantly, "but that would be wonderful. His name is Rascal." "Come here, Rascal, and let me measure your neck," Garth Shadwick said, leaning over to pat my complacent pet. "You don't need to measure him, Mr. Shadwick. Here's a string that's just the right length for the collar, with knots where the holes in the buckle should be, and allowing a little for when he gets bigger." The harness maker came as near to smiling as I had ever seen him. With swift precision, he went to work on a strong, light collar of pliable golden brown calfskin about 1/2 inch wide. He used his smallest awl to make the holes and his smallest needle and lightest wax thread. Then he went to his safe and brought out a tiny silver buckle, which he sewed to the collar with almost invisible stitches. It was the sort of work he would have done if asked to make a harness for a fairy coach. Finally, he put his glass to his eye, and on a very small silver nameplate inscribed Rascal in a fine Spencerian script. "That's the most beautiful raccoon collar I ever saw in my life," I said. "It's the only raccoon collar you ever saw," the harness maker chuckled gruffly, "and the only one I ever made. Better try it for size." I wasn't certain that Rascal would like to have the collar put around his neck, but I couldn't hurt Mr. Shadwick's feelings. I let the little raccoon feel it and smell it first, telling him it was his newest treasure. Rascal liked the shining buckle and nameplate and the texture of the soft leather. Finally, I slipped it around his neck, and to my surprise, he didn't struggle or try to nip me. Instead, he sat up on his square little bottom and began feeling the collar the way a woman sometimes fingers her pearls. Mr. Shadwick brought the floor mirror used for viewing riding boots, and Rascal, who had never before seen his mirror image, became greatly excited. He wondered what other raccoon was being fitted for a collar this morning. First, he bumped his nose trying to get through the mirror. Then, talking and trilling, he raced around behind the glass to meet the other raccoon, who, of course, wasn't there. Back he came, completely mystified, but still entranced. Finally, he gave it up as a puzzle too deep for his small brain and merely sat and viewed himself, chirring happily. Making the leash took a little longer, but again the harness maker worked with amazing dexterity. He cut 6 very slender strips of the same calfskin and began the most elaborate job of braiding I had ever seen. His fingers worked so swiftly I could not see which strands went over and which went under and through. The finished leash, inch by perfect inch, was as slim as the tip of my steel fishing rod. At my end of the leash he fastened a silver harness ring, at the other end a snap to attach to the collar. I knew that I didn't have enough money in my earthenware crock to pay for such a collar and leash complete with silver fittings. So I put my 4 quarters on Mr. Shadwick's workbench and said it was a down payment and that I would bring him something every week for the next 6 weeks. The harness maker gazed off through the window the way Rascal often did, his mind going back perhaps to his own boyhood when there weren't any gold-dang automobiles to ruin the finest profession in the world. "Why, son," he said, "I'd be cheating you if I took more than 25 cents for that leash and collar. Now get along with your little coon. I've got work to do." There had been an overcast when he had started downtown that morning, but the sun was shining brightly as we pedaled homeward. The opening of school was postponed for a month in the autumn of 1918. With so many young men away at the war, the women and older children tried to fill their places on the farms around Brailsford Junction. In this rich tobacco region, the crop is harvested in September, late enough to avoid shed burn, but early enough to avoid frost. This is heavy work, chopping the tobacco stalks, spudding these plants on laths, and hanging the tobacco in the sheds to dry. I was too slight to be of much assistance in the harvest field, but I continued to produce food in my war garden, bushels of carrots, beets, and potatoes. I used my garden as a justification for delaying the building of Rascal's cage, but I knew that his imprisonment could not be postponed forever, particularly after he developed a craving for a new nocturnal delight, the grapes hanging in purple clusters in nearby arbors. Rascal also sampled apples of many varieties, Jonathan's, winesaps, Tolman sweets, and he was growing increasingly casual about obeying my imperative trill, which meant, as he well knew, "Come down from that tree, you bad raccoon." I came to the reluctant conclusion that I would have to buy the materials and start constructing the cage. Taking my small hoard of coins from the earthenware crock, I snapped the leash on Rascal and walked down Albion Street toward Kai Jenkins' lumber yard. My raccoon had been introduced to his leash so gradually that he no longer strained against it painfully. Considering my mission, I found it hard to enjoy this season which had always given me so much pleasure. The yellow elm leaves drifting down, the first flash of crimson in the maples. Kai Jenkins had cheated me when I had brought lumber from my canoe, but he was so eager to see Rascal caged that he now pretended to be giving me a bargain on 2x4s and chicken wire. He merely asked how much money I had and took it all. "Comes out right to the penny," he said. The old miser added one other concession, promising to deliver the material by truck on the following morning if I would start building the cage on its arrival. I stopped at the post office to get our mail and found a letter from Herschel addressed to me. My fingers trembled as I opened it. I had dreamed several times that he had been wounded, and I had been reading Arthur Guy Embry's Over the Top, a crude but vivid book about the war. In every scene I imagined Herschel. In one persistent dream, I saw him leading a reconnaissance squad into no man's land at night, flattening himself as star shells burst and making his way through barbed wire entanglements where corpses dangled grotesquely. Much later, I learned that he had made scores of such excursions between the lines. Censorship made communication almost impossible in World War I, and Herschel's letters merely sent his love and confirmed the fact that he was unwounded. I remember one sentence in particular because it was typical of his wry good humor. "Send me some Paris garters, Sterling. They claim in their ads that no metal can touch you." The fact that Herschel was still alive and unhurt, and that Rascal and I still had one afternoon before I must start building the cage, raised my spirits considerably. I made jelly sandwiches for the two of us, and we climbed the cleats I had nailed to the oak tree, taking with us our picnic lunch and a copy of Westward Ho. High in our favorite crotch, we ate and I read, fascinated by the adventures of Amos Leigh. Rascal, meanwhile, indulged in a favorite pastime of raccoons, sunbathing on a lofty limb. He lay flat on his fat little belly, on a branch he could comfortably embrace, letting all four legs dangle over the sides in easy balance. His muzzle pointed upstream on the bough, and his handsome ringed tail lay straight behind him. And there he dozed for hours, absorbing the healing sunshine of September as though he were storing up warmth for the long, cold season ahead. I was equally happy and quite as lost to the world as I sailed the Spanish Main with Amos, followed him into the forest to find the beautiful white girl Ayacanora, and moved with mounting excitement toward the defeat of the Spanish Armada. We were tree dwellers, my raccoon and I, and we rather wished we never have to set foot on earth again. Hunger brought us down at last, however. My father was in Montana on ranch business, so Rascal and I ate whatever we pleased for supper, and then climbed our tree once again to watch the stars come out. I told him some of the things my mother had told me about those distant suns, arranged in their shining constellations. Then I had a sad but happy thought. If Ursa Major, the great bear, was my constellation, Ursa Minor, the little bear, was by natural right Rascal's constellation. Long years after we were both gone, there we still would be, swimming across the midnight sky together. There were two things I must do: plan the cage carefully, and convince Rascal that it would be a pleasure to live in his new home. I had been observing him closely for the last few days to discover which part of the backyard he enjoyed the most. There could be no doubt about his preference. It was an area about 12 feet square, which extended from the base of the oak tree below his hole to the side of the barn. This included a smooth expanse of grass and white clover, and my bait pool with its running water and constant supply of minnows. Just as I had let Rascal become slowly acquainted with his collar and then his leash, I now invited his help in constructing the cage. When the wire and 2x4s arrived, I laid out the square, dug holes for the posts, and also sank a 6-inch trench along each side for pegging down the bottom edge of the wire. Rascal enjoyed all this activity without understanding its true meaning. He reached into each excavation, crawled back and forth through the central tunnel in the rolls of chicken wire, fished languidly in the bait pool, or merely went to sleep in the grass. My father sent a postcard from Montana saying he would not return for another 10 days or 2 weeks. Fortunately, we ran a charge account at the meat market and at one of the groceries. But to raise money for staples and hinges, I had to dig and sell 2 more bushels of my potatoes. I was somewhat lonesome and very grateful for Rascal's companionship night and day. Possibly I could have built the cage in less time had I not been aware of its purpose. However, the posts were soon set, and in another day the framework nailed together. It was a cube 12 feet square which gave easy access to Rascal's hole in the oak tree. It also encompassed the bait pool, using 12 feet of the barn along the eastern side. I had to fasten wire securely across the top of this cube, knowing that Rascal could climb any fence ever built. I used an old screen door for the principal entrance, nailing chicken wire to the frame and hinging the door to a sturdy post. But during the several days I spent building the cage, I was careful not to close this exit. Never for a moment did Rascal feel penned in. I fed him his favorite foods within the wire, always dreading the day when I must hook the door. It seemed to me a wicked thing to take a wild raccoon kitten from the woods, a little animal who loved speed and adventure and exploration, and to imprison him like an animal at the zoo. I had seen the big cats and the bears pace up and down their cages in hopeless misery. Would Rascal yearn like that for his lost freedom? He must have more space, I thought, and more shelter. Then I had a small inspiration. I hurried to my workbench to get a compass, brace and bit, and keyhole saw. Making sure that my calculations were right, I drew a circle on the side of the barn big enough for a raccoon, but too small for a dog. I then bored 4 holes within the circle, and using my slender saw, cut a neat opening into a long disused box stall inside the barn. Finally, I sanded the edges of this doorway so that it would not scratch Rascal, and I showed him the net result. Rascal loved holes of all sizes, from crayfish holes to be explored with a sensitive paw to holes such as this one, big enough to crawl into. While I put fresh straw in the box stall and enclosed it in chicken wire, my raccoon spent most of his time going in and out at his pleasant little door. His home was becoming more attractive day by day. He still didn't understand, however, that I was building him a prison, and every time the neighbors asked when I would lock him up, I said maybe tomorrow. The most exciting event in Brailsford Junction each September was the Irish picnic and horse fair. It was always held on a Saturday somewhat earlier in the month than the country fair at Janesville, to which many of the race horses and exhibitors later gravitated. I do not know why it is called the Irish picnic, since a very small percentage of our town was Irish, but they did possess most of the good trotters and pacers of our area, and in all probability had instituted these races which now attracted spectators by the hundreds. Mike Conway, our neighbor to the west, owned a terrific trotter, a spirited stallion that had sired several of the most likely colts and fillies in the county. Early on the morning of any Irish picnic, Mike was to be seen currying Donnybrook to a satin sheen, washing the sulky and oiling his racing harness. Donnybrook seemed as aware as his master that this was the great day. His whinny could be heard at a considerable distance by interested mares, and he frisked about his pasture, kicking up his heels and tossing his head. Some racehorses have a beloved dog or cat for a companion. Donnybrook had developed a strong affection for Rascal. Whenever my raccoon climbed one of the posts of the neat white fence around the padlock, the black stallion immediately became gentle, changing his shrill whiny to a soft whicker. While Rascal waited on the fence post, Donnybrook would trot over to greet him. The raccoon always ran his small hands over the big velvet muzzle, fingering the bright rings of the halter. Naturally, Rascal and I would be cheering for Donnybrook in any race he might ever run. Across the street on the same morning, Reverend Thurman was tuning up the carburetor and making other last-minute adjustments on his Model T Roadster. He was bellowing hymns which were explosively interrupted when he pinched a finger or dropped a wrench. Mike Conway and Gabriel Thurman had never been the best of friends, but in recent weeks their feud had taken a new turn. Mike loved horses and hated automobiles almost as ardently as his friend Garth Shadwick. Thurman was terrified of horses, but entranced with automobiles. Mike wouldn't admit that he was afraid of anything, but the fact remained that he had never taken a ride in an automobile until a recent day when the minister had offered him a lift in his Ford. Mike silently asked the protection of St. Patrick, stepped into the shivering, shaking, self-propelled chariot of destruction, and they were off. On every possible occasion, Gabriel blew his horn, a klaxon, nerve-wracking enough to frighten every horse on the block. As he turned from Albion into Fulton, the principal business street, the minister pulled down the gas lever and went roaring through the traffic with satanic delight, while Mike muttered a fervent "Hail Mary" and turned a patriotic green. Mike made it a point to return the favor. 2 days later, he hitched his training cart to Donnybrook and offered Thurman a ride across town to his church. The minister, who wasn't entirely dim-witted, said thank you just the same. Mike taunted him a little about his courage, and Gabriel flushed a bright pink and climbed into the cart. The trot down Albion was not too frightening, but the established course was Fulton Street, as both men knew. In front of Pringle's store, Mike touched up the ever-willing stallion. By the time they reached the Tobacco Exchange Bank, Donnybrook had hit his top speed. Thurman didn't start calling upon Jehovah until they were abreast of the Badger Ice Cream Parlor. But long before they reached the Monarch Laboratories, which produced a nerve tonic for just such occasions, his eyes were rolling and he was screaming, "Help! Murder! Runaway horse! Let me out, you fool!" The entire town knew all about both rides, and the best-informed gossips insisted that Conway and Thurman had made some sort of wager, highly improper on the part of a minister, and that the mysterious payoff might come during the day of the Irish picnic. I was as curious as everyone else, so taking Rascal on my shoulders, I crossed the street to Thurman's parsonage, where he continued to work on his car. "I'd be glad to polish your brass radiator," I said. Reverend Thurman glared at me and at Rascal. "The best way to polish a radiator is with a coon pelt, and if that animal of yours ever invades my property again—" "You wouldn't do that to my pet raccoon." "Oh, yes, indeed, I certainly would," said the terrible-tempered minister of the gospel. "I'll tack his hide right up in the woodshed. Thought you were going to lock him in his cage like you promised." "In a few days," I said. "You can see I've got him on a leash." "Step in the right direction," Thurman granted. I knew it was impossible, but my curiosity was now quite out of control. I was slightly shocked to hear myself asking, "What's your bet with Mike Conway, Reverend Thurman?" "Bet?" Thurman shouted. "What bet? Ministers never bet. Now, you and your coon get out of here and stay out." We returned to our front porch, and Rascal and I sat in wicker chairs watching a veritable parade. Our street was the direct route to the fairgrounds, and all the exhibits and livestock, the racehorses and the automobiles, must come past us in review, as though we were judges or privileged guests. There were always a few well-groomed hunters and hackney ponies, thoroughbreds and Tennessee walking horses, 5 gaiters, and other pampered creatures moving with pride and grace toward assured white, red, or blue ribbons. But our region was one of working prosperity rather than effortless luxury, so most of our beautiful horses were of the draft breeds. We had massive Belgians, often weighing more than a ton and standing 17 hands high, Suffolks, Clydesdales, and Percherons. In the pulling contest, these tremendous and faithful animals were so brave and loyal to their masters that I could not watch them long in their heartbreaking performances. Apparently, they would soon be outmoded by the other forms of locomotion passing our front row seat, automobiles of every kind, from Fords to white streamers and twin six-packards. The sulky Surreys and neat green farm wagons with gleaming red wheels moved very slowly by comparison to any automobile. My father was still in Montana, so this year he would not be with me, viewing the exhibits and watching the races. I raided my earthenware crock for the last handful of small silver, snapped the leash on Rascal, mounted my bicycle, and we were on our way. The world was sparkling and cool that bright September morning. The dust had been settled during the night by a sprinkle of rain, not enough to make a muddy track, just enough to put ozone in the air and dew on the grass. Whistling any tune that came into my head, I pedaled happily toward the fairground with Rascal in the basket. In the traffic were additional guarantees of a good day. a pie wagon, the ice cream truck, which also carried many cases of root beer, the popcorn and Cracker Jack wagon, and a balloon man riding a bicycle and blowing an enchanting little whistle that lured children as surely as the pipe of the Pied Piper. From up ahead within the fairgrounds, we could hear the steam calliope playing "Come, Josephine" in my flying machine. And now the bright tents and the white buildings came into view, and we could hear the happy buzz and murmur of the crowd already gathering. Yes, this was certainly the day of the Irish picnic, worth coming miles to see. I put my bicycle in the bicycle rack under the grandstand, and with Rascal on my shoulder began to tour the grounds. We saw all the canned goods, quilts, and other fancy work in the homecraft department. In another building, we admired the huge pumpkins, Hubbard squashes and melons, the seed corn, apples, and grapes. It was a good thing that I had Rascal on a leash. He wanted to run his avid hands over everything he saw, like a woman shopper at a fire sale. In the case of the prize-winning bunch of grapes, I restrained him just in time. On visiting the livestock building, Rascal walked to the top rail of the pens, utterly confident and unafraid. Calves and colts came over to say hello. The fattened lambs were also gentle, but a big Poland China sow with her autumn litter was menacing, and a merino ram charged the fence on which Rascal was standing, moving like an oncoming locomotive and crashing his big, curled horns into the wooden partition. Rascal would have been thrown into the pen by this heavy jolt if I had not literally dragged him from danger by his leash. We were more careful after that, as we visited the horse pavilion to see again, at closer range, the beautiful animals we had seen passing our house earlier in the morning. Most of the horses were not entered in any special event except the grand parade around the racetrack. They were judged in their pavilion by 3 craggy and serious horsemen brought in for the occasion, and some of the blue, red, and white ribbons had already been awarded. But out in the racing stables were the handsome trotters and pacers who would later watch in action. There were 2-year-olds, both colts and fillies, who would compete in the junior classic. They were high-spirited young things with fire and mischief in their eyes, and I kept Rascal well back from the paddock doors. Most of the 3-year-olds were better behaved, and of course there was Donnybrook, who wickered his greeting and nuzzled Rascal affectionately. In 2 of the last 3 years he had won the senior classic, and I think he knew that we were pulling for him. It was pure delight to be showing Rascal all this for the first time, and he was constantly interested in all that he saw. We rode the merry-go-round together, Rascal sitting ahead of me on the wooden pony, going gaily up and down, round and round. He wanted a second ride, but I had to be careful of my dimes or we would never get through the day without going bankrupt. We couldn't resist the Ferris wheel, however. It was the biggest one that had ever come to the Irish picnic, and when we reached the top we could see all the way to the village of Albion far across the marshes. Height didn't frighten either of us, and it was a little like flying to soar upward and come swooping down again. Rascal would gladly have ridden all day, and so would I, but the silver in my pocket was disappearing far too rapidly. It didn't cost anything to enter the 3-legged race, but when I saw some of those long-legged 14-year-olds teaming up, I knew that Oscar Sunderland and I didn't have a chance. Instead, we decided to enter another free event soon to begin, the pie-eating contest. Gabbling happily about Rascal and the coming muskrat season, we walked toward the long plank table and adjoined benches laid out with 20 blueberry pies. "I seen a mink track," Oscar said. "Lives in the tile that drains Mud Lake. You got your traps oiled?" "Not yet, but I sent to St. Louis for our fur catalogs. Boy, we're going to make a fortune this fall. We're going to be filthy rich." "I could use some money," I admitted. "I'm just about stone broke." "Gee, so am I. Flat busted. Say, look at that pie. Not as good as your mother makes." "She does make a good pie at that," Oscar admitted. "Mom's all right." We sat down on either side of the table, 10 boys on each side. Our hands were tied behind our backs, and while we awaited the starting gun, we shouted happy insults at each other. The object of this messy contest was to eat the full-size pie faster than any other contestant. You had to eat it with your face and pull the pie tin back with your teeth if it started slipping beyond reach. I noticed a knot in the wind plank that might be helpful. If I could maneuver the pie tin right up against that knot, I could really dig in. Then I discovered that I was directly across the table from Slammy Stillman, and I knew this would be the toughest pie-eating contest I ever entered. Slammy was the biggest, greediest, meanest 12-year-old in town. We hated each other with a fine, soul-satisfying hatred born of many fistfights in which I was always outweighed and outslugged. But by boyhood rules you could never refuse to fight. We glared at each other balefully. This was a grudge fight to the last blueberry and the last crumb of pie crust. Bang! We were off with a good, juicy plunge through the crust and deep into the berries. The knot in the plank helped a little, but not enough. It held the pie tin for about 3 good slurps, then let it slip. There was so much commotion, noise, and splattering of blueberries, with some boys practically lying on the table trying to recover their pie tins, that it was hard to see who was winning. The crowd around us was roaring with laughter, but it wasn't very funny to us. We were desperate, exhausted, covered with blueberries, and breathing hard. Everybody wanted the $3 grand prize, not to mention the glory and the blue ribbon. I was practically certain that only Slammy Stillman was ahead of me, and I didn't see how I could ever catch up. Then my best friend came to my rescue. Rascal knew all about pies, and he loved blueberries. He leaped to the table and started helping me eat my pie, licking it up at a wonderful rate. Best of all, he was working from the other side of the pie, adding 5 1/2 pounds of raccoon to the resistance already supplied by the knot. My tin scarcely slipped at all. Slammy Stillman was the first to notice. He was completely infuriated. This character, who never abided by any rule, started screaming, "Cheater, cheater, look at that cheater!" While Slammy was yelling, he couldn't eat pie. Rascal and I were gaining on him fast. The judges were laughing so hard they couldn't catch their breath to shout a ruling. Rascal and I came in strong on the last lick, and an eighth of a pie ahead of our nearest competitor, who luckily was Oscar Sunderland. Neither Spalding nor Hoyle has ever published a handbook on pie eating contests, and the judges were into a huddle that became vociferous. Rascal and I were partially disqualified. Oscar got the $3 and the blue ribbon, which made me happy because Oscar was my trapping partner and as nearly penniless as I. But I received the consolation prize, a real league baseball autographed by every member of our local team. Slammy would have been red in the face if he hadn't been completely blue in the face. All day long, he grumbled and threatened, shouting "cheater" whenever he saw me and my raccoon. It was a delicious victory. The September sun was directly overhead, but for some reason Rascal and I did not respond to the dinner bells being rung by warm and hearty matrons serving food in several denominational tents. On the Methodist menu were roast chicken with dressing, 3 vegetables, and blueberry pie. It was this last item which convinced us that we didn't need a noonday meal. At 2 p.m, the horse races began. A beautiful bay filly from Janesville nosed out the favorite colt from Madison in the Junior Classic. She had the movements of a Swiss watch, lifting her feet proudly, her muscles rippling smoothly. After this upset, the 3-year-olds performed more predictably, with a magnificent pacer from Stockton breaking the track record for 8 furlongs. As race followed race, however, the spectators asked each other, "Where's Donnybrook?" Mike Conway was not cheering his black stallion. Much as he enjoyed winning the Senior Classic, he had another aim in view today, the all but impossible hope that he could outrun a greater menace than any competing horse, in fact, Gabriel Thurman's Model T. There are probably no more than 50 trotters who have pulled a sulky 1 mile in 2 minutes. Possibly 90 pacers have achieved this immortality. Generally speaking, it takes a great horse in harness racing to speed 1 furlong in 15 seconds, or 1 mile in 2 minutes. Similarly, unless handled by a racing driver, few early Fords could top twice this speed, 60 miles an hour or a mile a minute. The mathematics of this race seemed obvious. A very fast trotter was matched against a well-attuned Ford. By any sensible odds, Reverend Gabriel Thurman should have been asked to drive his Tin Lizzie 4 times around the half-mile oval, while Donnybrook wheeled Mike Conway twice around this track. All through the grandstand, the news spread swiftly. Mike had bet that he could go twice around the track, while Thurman and his Ford made a mere 3 rounds. There was one shrewd catch, however. Donnybrook needed no cranking, and Thurman must wait for the starting gun before cranking his Ford, jumping into his roadster and streaking off after the stallion and his master. Mike Conway had watched the impatient and impetuous Gabriel Thurman crank his Ford on many occasions. He knew that Thurman always took reckless chances in 3 departments. He placed the gas and also the spark lever much too low. When aggravated, he always jerked the choke wire, which emerged at the left of the crank, thus flooding his carburetor. Mike was no mechanic, but he had often used his stopwatch on Thurman's futile attempts to start his car. Gabriel Thurman was aware of his impetuosity. He knew that in his eagerness to make his Ford rumble and roar, he caused backfires that nearly broke his arm. He was being tremendously cautious, putting the spark and gas barely below the permissible level, and promising himself he would not touch the ring attached to the wire that primed the carburetor. The flag was lowered, the barrier raised, and Mike and Donnybrook were off in a flash. It was sheer joy to watch the stallion lift his white stockinged feet. Mike rode comfortably on the seat of the sulky, as much a part of his trotter as though he had been astride. Gabriel Thurman gave the crank a whirl and was nearly knocked into the dust by the backfire. He rushed to his steering wheel, adjusted gas and spark, and tried once again. A very small pop created such exasperation that the minister pulled the priming wire with a desperate yank. The carburetor flooded until it dripped gas beneath the car. By this time, Mike Conway, and Donnybrook had completed a full round of the track and had only one more to go. By luck rather than skill, Thurman now started his Ford, and off he blasted, sounding his klaxon and pulling his gas lever to the lowest notch. This was almost an even race, if the Ford could make 60 miles an hour while Donnybrook held 30. On the open road, Thurman might have won, but taking the curves without leaping the fence was his problem. Donnybrook crossed the finish line leading by 2 lengths, the indisputable winner. There was one other reward for Rascal and for me. Donnybrook moved over to the fence where my raccoon was watching and waiting eagerly. With more than 1,000 spectators enjoying the sight, Donnybrook nuzzled Rascal, while Rascal ran his hands over the stallion's nose and bridle. Once again, he had tasted victory. I came home in the early evening to the empty house. I called the telegraph office in the railroad station to learn if my father had wired from Montana, telling me when he was coming home, but of course he had sent no message. I took Rascal to his cage and sat for a long time, talking to him and petting him while he ate his evening meal. Then, steeling myself to the dreadful deed, I stepped from the cage and closed the door behind me, hooking it firmly on the outside. Rascal didn't understand what had happened at first. He came over to the door and asked me politely to open it and let him out. Then the thought suddenly struck him that he was trapped, caged, imprisoned. He ran swiftly around the square of wire, then into the barn, through the hole I'd cut, and all over that inside enclosure, then back again, frantic now. I went into the house to get away from his voice, but it came to me through the open windows, pleading, terrified, asking for me, telling me he loved me and that he'd always trusted me. After a while, I couldn't stand it any longer, and I went out and opened the wire door. He clung to me and cried and talked about it, asking that unanswerable question. So I took him to bed with me, and we both fell into a fitful sleep, touching each other again and again throughout the night for reassurance.